Before the tour, let us talk to the curator of this place. He will introduce himself. He will tell us the history about this place. He will also tell us about Tom Mboya and tell us how this place came to be. And once he's done that, we do the tour, and we will do the tour with an understanding of where we are coming from and where we are going. Welcome.
Allow me to welcome you to the Tom Mboya Mausoleum. My name's Tom Wor. I manage the mausoleum. Actually, here is where we have the remains of a great hero of Africa, the late Thomas Joseph Mboya. Now, if you're keen at the epitaph, between August 15, 1930 to July 5, 69, Tom died at the age of 39. That was a very young age, and that would actually mean he was still a resident within the family homestead. Now, just after this wall, we have several houses that belongs to the family. Tom's father actually was a polygamist who had 5 wives, and as we speak, we still have 4 of Tom's stepmothers living within the compound. Now, just after this gate, if you are keen, you'll notice some rubbles. That is actually where we had Tom's first house. Now, the house is not standing as per the Luo old culture. In the Luo old culture, when somebody dies, most who are at a tender age and leaves behind a young family, the immediate family would sit down and agree on who to take the responsibility. That actually would mean that there was that culture of inheritance. So after Tom's death, the family sat down and agreed on Tom's brother, Alphonse Okuku. Okuku was actually immediate follower of Tom. Then the same culture would dictate that if you inherit your brother's wife, you don't stay with her in the same house. That first house has to be brought down, then a new one be erected. So there was one, a more modern, that was erected, but later again demolished as Tom's immediate family moved from the family homestead to establish their own home. Even if Tom would have lived, still he had to move to pave ways for the rest of his brothers to move. In the Luo culture, we normally move according to birth, as in the firstborn has to move first, followed by the second, the third, up to the last one. So Tom had actually bought a land at a place called Lambwe, and that is where he had planned to have his home built. Though he died before moving, but then later through the stewardship of Alphonse, Tom's brother, and Pamela, Tom's wife, they managed to move Tom's family to Lambwe Valley. That is exactly where we buried Pamela in 2009. But before that, in 2004, we lost Tom's elder son, Peter. Peter was a great commercial lawyer, so both Peter and Pamela were buried at Lambwe. Now, there's an island just close or opposite the Rusinga Island. This island is called Mfangano Island. Now, before independence, the colonial government used Mfangano Island as a detention center. They would pick the stubborn guys within the country, and then they would dump them in Mfangano Island. Many people died, but others survived. Now, on their way out of Mfangano, they would visit other islands and mainland, then they would pick energetic men. Then they actually take them to various places of work. So Tom's father is actually part of those who were picked from Rusinga and directly taken to a place called Kilimambogo, just some kilometers from Thika town. Tom's father was picked at an early age. It's just when he got married, they were still young couples, so both of them had to go to Kilimambogo, and that is exactly where Tom was born. Tom started most of his lower primary education at the Kaba Catholic Missionary School. Then later, Tom would be transferred to St. Mary's Yala for his upper primary. Upon completion, Tom would join the then Holy Ghost Secondary School. Now, Holy Ghost is today Mango High School. That is where Tom did his junior secondary, the Form 1 and Form 2. Now, in those days, there were no permanent employment. People were employed, or people would work according to their ability. If you become weak, you are taken home, then an energetic man is replaced with you. So when Tom was in Form 2, his father became weak and was taken home. And remember, in those days, there were no retirement benefits. People were given materials things. So Tom's father carried home a slasher, a panga, a jembe, a wheelbarrow, a bicycle, and a radio. Remember, these things could not make Tom proceed with his education. So Tom had to drop in Form 2, citing lack of school fee. Now, the colonial government had actually preserved a course for the dropout students. This was a P1 teaching course. Tom had actually knew very well that in future he was going to be a P1 teacher or a primary teacher. But now, Tom was a devoted Catholic, and you know most of the schools were headed by the Catholic priests. So because they were very close, they made a way for Tom to a gene school in Lower Kabete. There was a college called the Royal Sanitary Institute. Now here, Tom would take a course on a public health inspectorate. The course, the college were offering some tokens to the students. When you come from that college, you would be directly employed, and you are allowed to work both in East and Central Africa. Actually, Tom wanted to work outside Kenya. He wanted to work maybe in one of the developed African countries. But Tom did very well and was directly or grabbed by the Nairobi City Council and employed as a public health inspector. Remember, Tom became the first black to be employed as a public health inspector. This forced him to meet with a lot of challenges. One, as a public health inspector, Tom would actually not be allowed to wear a long trouser. Instead, he would be provided with a white khaki short, a stocking, and shoes. Tom would be forced to trek from his house to the working stations as opposed to his white colleagues. And Tom would actually be paid a fifth of what his white colleagues were being paid. So this is actually what made Tom to, or motivated him to come up with some groupings. I mean, some associations, unions that would actually talk on behalf of the workers and at least negotiate for their salaries and wages. Here, Tom would introduce the local workers' union authority. He came up with the labor movement, the trade union movement, and even a political party. These were basically to uplift the living standard of a common man. Now, Tom later was introduced to the American trade unionist by one called William H. Shainman. Shainman was a great trade unionist. So he gave Tom a scholarship to the US for one year and a half. Now, when Tom returned from the US, he found when many political parties, many unions and associations had been formed, and there was a lot of pressure from the unions to the colonial government. This forced the colonial government to call for a state of emergency. They banned all the political parties, all the unions, all the associations. But lucky enough, they spared Tom's union. And that was because many a times Tom believed on diplomacy. He did not want to engage in physical fighting or maybe confrontations. So Tom took advantage over this. He would collect the grievances among the banned unions, and then he would present them to the colonial master. This is actually part of what made Tom to rise through the ranks up to the international level. Now later, it forced the colonial government to have a joint parliament, the Legico. But then they restricted. They said they will only accommodate 8 members from the local. Tom was part of the first 8. They went there and struggled until the number was added to 14. Now later, Kenya got her independence through Dominion, where the Queen was still the head. Kenyatta became the Prime Minister, and Tom was the Minister for Justice and Constitutional Affairs. A year later, when Kenya got independence, Tom straight away became the Minister of Economic Planning. This is a position Tom held till the time of his death. Now, during this short period, Tom had done much to Kenya and even beyond. We remember him as one man who actually led 2 delegations into the Lancaster's house to deliberate on Kenya's independence. Tom was very instrumental in the writing of first Kenya's constitution. He actually wrote a lot of policy papers. This would include the Sessional Paper 10. That was meant to govern the economy of the entire Africa. Tom designed the Kenya flag. He became the first KANU Secretary General right from the inception of KANU to 1969, the time of his death. He was the pioneer of trade union movement. He actually helped build Solidarity Building in Gikomba that houses Atwoli's offices up to date. Tom was a civil rights champion, and he came up with a grand project, the African American Airlift Project, that had seen a lot of Kenyans and Africans through scholarship into different universities and colleges. We celebrate people like Wangare Maathai, who was once a Nobel Prize winner, people like Kibaki, former president, people like Saitoti, Kamoto, people like Onyonka, people like Adua Witi, the late journalist Philip Ochieng, Obama Sr., name them. Now, in 1968, our first president, Kenyatta, suffered a stroke. And it forced Kenyatta to call for a cabinet sitting, and actually hinted to them that going by his health and age, he would actually not continue being our president. But Kenyatta had a proposal that among the cabinet, they would actually choose somebody to be backed by him, Kenyatta, to become his successor. And I believe this is where all the problems started. Almost all the cabinets wanted to succeed Kenyatta, so they could not pick a name, or they could not mention somebody's name. It forced Kenyatta to leave this open, that whoever would convince the electorate would actually become his successor. Now, going by Tom's development record, Tom stood a better chance. In fact, he was seen as the obvious successor. Now, it interrupted what was called the political succession battle. This pitted him against some clique of powerful ministers, more so from the president's side, those who had leaned so much on the president, those who wanted to retain power by all cost. Now, because Tom had gone ahead of them in terms of development, he posed a threat to them. He was seen as a threat. Now they started looking into ways and means of blocking him from contesting. At one point, they tried and sneaked an amendment in the parliament to bar him from contesting by raising age. They had actually said, for you to vie for presidency, you must at least have 42 years and above. Tom had only 39 years. But now, him being a schemer excellent, he would actually raise numbers in the parliament to beat the amendment. So the only option was now to hatch and plot for his assassination. Now, it followed by a series of political assassination attempts. Just to mention few, we remember there was an attempt to kill Tom just in the street, and these were like 3 attempts. And among the 3, 2 people, innocent Kenyans, were shot, and 2 died, but 1 survived with serious wounds. Another time, Tom's watchman was hired, and many a times Tom would work up to very late in the evening. And when he realized it was late, he would release everybody close to him. This would include the driver, the personal assistant, and even his bodyguards. And then he would drive home late. The watchman knew this. Tom's rivals knew this as well. So they convinced the watchman that it was easy to kill him on his way in as he drives inside. So the watchman was paid. They had a gun for him, and they set a date. But it was not a good date for them, because this time Tom had actually planned to come home. And normally when he comes home, he does not release the driver. He normally comes with the driver. So this time, no, it was not as usual. He released part of his people, but retained the driver. So they drove home a bit late, and the watchman was not very careful. He did not take his time to look keenly who was on the steering. And as he opened the gate, he immediately shot, not knowing he was shooting a different person from Tom. So when he shot, he only shot the driver's shoulder. Tom and the driver were in fact, they were amazed. They could not understand exactly what was happening, because this watchman is somebody they had worked with for many years, and they knew his innocency. They didn't expect such thing to have come from him. So it took them like 30 minutes silence in the vehicle. There was nobody talking. Only the driver was bleeding. Now the watchman was convinced that he had shot Tom. So he went, called the family. They came crying, yelling, because they were convinced that Tom was shot by armed robbers as he opened the door. But now when Tom heard the noises, he did not want that noise to continue. So he came out of the vehicle and told them he was alive, he was not shot. Now the driver, the watchman, when realized that Tom was alive, he made his way through the masses and escaped, but he did not went away with it. Just because those who had sent him, the Tom's rivals, knew very well that if Tom was alive and the driver is also, the watchman is also alive, then it will be known that they were the people who sent him. So they wanted to seal the evidence. What they did, they followed the watchman up to his house, and the next day the watchman was found dead in his house. Now there was this meeting that was supposed to be attended by the president, but now going by his health and age, he would actually not attend. But he preferred Tom to represent him. There were a lot of wrangles. They tried to convince him not to send Tom, but Kenyatta was so much determined. He believed on Tom. He knew Tom would represent the nation. So he insisted, and at long last sent Tom. Now when Tom's rival saw that Kenyatta was stubborn, what they did was to go ahead of Tom and convince Assassination that Tom was like planning to overthrow Kenyatta's government, and therefore Kenyatta wanted him dead. In the real sense, Kenyatta was not in the picture. He actually did not know there was a plan to have Tom killed in Ethiopia. And you know, Assassination and Kenyatta were like twin brothers. They were so close. And if Assassination would hear anything against Kenyatta, he would become so bitter. So what he did was to hire a suicide bomber, and Tom was supposed to die just in the same way Bruce Mackenzie died from Uganda.